Joined on the line right now by the Commissioner of the BC Hockey League. We've got John Grisdale with us. John, thanks so much for taking the time to chat here this morning.
Always a pleasure, Brian. Thanks.
So we seem to do this on an annual basis simply because I think some of the rules and that type of thing are a little confusing at times. We've got the January 10th deadline coming up. What exactly does this day mean?
Well, the Hockey Canada, it's a regulation within Hockey Canada. There are two carding deadlines, December 1st and January 10th. Specifically to December 1st, teams are initially at the beginning of the season allotted 45 playing cards and 5 non-playing cards for administration. So during the course of the year, teams sign and release players. On December 1st, teams must cut down to those players on their current roster that are signed. So they can be any number from around up to 23, plus unused cards to 25. So if a team has extra cards they have not used, and they have on their roster 20 players, then they can have 5 cards available to sign and release players from December 1st to January 10th. Then on January 10th, teams must cut down to 23 players, a maximum of 23 players. So a team may decide that they want 23 players, so they just sign and release players to 23, or if they have cards available. Or some teams in the past have tried to reduce their rosters to even lower. They just don't want to carry extra players. So it makes no difference. But they must reduce the roster to 23 players on January 10th. That's all it is.
And is it at all any sort of trade deadline, though?
Well, it's referred to as a trade deadline in hockey. I mean, on the Hockey Canada regulation, there's no such thing as a trade in hockey, but in junior ranks there is, of course, and we refer to as a trade deadline. But it's really a sign and release deadline.
Okay, so after that date, is it possible that teams could make transactions with each other if they have available cards, or no?
Yes, if a team has on their roster 22 players, as an example, on January 10th at midnight, that means, and they have one card that they have not used out of their initial 45, they can carry that forward, and they have the actual final signing deadline is February 10th. So any player out there that they feel could help them that is not carded after January 10th, so is free, and he's eligible by age, he can then card with that team if he wishes, up to including February 10th.
So using the Merritt Centennials as an example, right now the Centennials have 22 players signed on their roster. That means that if Luke Pierce so desires, he could go out and acquire a player without having to drop one.
That's right. And if he decides not to on January 10th, and he has an extra card available, and he has a card that he hasn't used out of his 45, which I believe Luke has, then he would then be able, if there, not often does it happen, but if there was a player out there somewhere that was free, that hadn't carded anywhere, they could use a card on him.
Or would that work if there was a player that wanted to make the jump from Junior B to Junior A and he was released by his Junior B club, like there was an agreement between the two that he was going to make the jump to Junior A for the stretch drive or whatever, and the team had a card available? Could that happen too?
Yeah, I mean, typically that happens on or before January 10th. The Junior B team would just release him, and the Junior A team would, if a card was available, sign him then. But if the Junior B team released him, there's no real advantage. If the Junior B team released him at 11:59 on January 10th, that meant that particular player had no place to play at that moment, right? So on January 11th, he didn't have a team that he was carded to.
Right.
So the Centennials could use, if they had an extra card available, they could use that to sign him. But typically that would happen before.
Now, you mentioned a deadline of midnight. Now, is that a Pacific time deadline, or is that a sort of the way that it works across the province? Because if you've got teams that are trading with, say, the Manitoba Junior League or teams back in Ontario or Quebec or the Maritimes, how does it work in terms of the deadline?
Well, that's a Hockey Canada deadline. So the brand, BC Hockey, they monitor and deal with all of the carding issues within in BC. So that's their deadline. The BC Hockey League specific deadline is across Canada, Canadian-wide CJHL transactions. It's 6 p.m. Pacific, which makes it 10 p.m. Atlantic.
Right.
Then we allow 1 hour for any other team, any of our teams, to complete interleague trades. So that's till 7 p.m. Then that gives them from 7 p.m. to 8 p.m. to actually release any of the players that they're going to release on the 10th. It's really a final release date, so they have to look at their rosters and make sure all of the players that they want released are released by midnight. So it gives them 5 hours to clean up the roster. So say the Merritt Centennials want to release a player, and that player is then picked up by Prince George. Well, the Centennials, Luke Pierce has to release him before midnight, and Prince George has to go in on the carding console, card him before midnight. So Luke Pierce would then, between 7 and say 9, they would actually make sure the Merritt Centennials released him, and Prince George would go in there and see that he's been released, and then request his card, use a card on him.
Okay, so it's almost like it's a sign and release deadline as opposed to a trade deadline, like you were saying.
Yeah, without question, it's a sign and I mean, that's what it's referred to, because again, Hockey Canada doesn't have what they call trade deadlines.
Okay, now in terms of finding out about deals, I know a lot of it is left up to a situation for each individual franchise, but what is sort of the protocol once teams agree on a player that's been signed and released? Is it signed off by yourself or the league, or what's sort of the process once teams have agreed on a transaction?
All transactions, player moves or transfers are signed off by the league commissioners, presidents, first, and then the teams then release and or sign them accordingly. So it's all done in advance of the deadline times. Release players are just done by the teams. So if the player, Luke is going to release a player outright, then his obligation will be, I'm going to release John Grisdale from the team. Then he would tell me, I'm going to release you, so that John Grisdale would have it, and tell other teams, say maybe Junior B teams, look, he's going to be released. If he's not, find a Junior A team before midnight. He's free to sign with you.
Right, and that's because it's also, since it's a Hockey Canada deadline, that also will apply to the Junior B clubs as well.
They've got to know. They've got to have a roster spot available for John Grisdale should he not be signed by a Junior A team.
Is there ever a circumstance where a trade is not given the rubber stamp by the BCHL?
Well, if the player is not in good standing, or there's issues around it, or if a team tries to do something where they trying to trade a player they don't have the rights to, that they had previously released. So situations like that can occur. That's why we scrutinize everything. We'll look at each player, say, involved in a transfer, and player on Team A, make sure that he's carded to Team A, and player on Team B, he's carded to Team B. And so we noted that, so we approve it. Then Team A releases their player, Team B releases their player, and the branches move the player from one team to the other.
And is there a situation where if teams agree on a player transfer and that player decides not to report, does that make a trade void at all or a transfer void at all?
Oh, no. The transfers in the BC Hockey League are not conditional on a player reporting. So if the player doesn't want to go there, then the player doesn't play hockey. He's effectively finished as of January 11th for the year.
Unless another agreement is worked out prior to the deadline.
It can't be, because the deal is done. And if you're talking about the deadline, any transaction that's signed off by the league, players are not subject to the transfer is not subject to players reporting. So if players don't want to come and it's January 9th at 12 p.m., then the team has a choice to release them outright on January 10th or carry them through. If they carry them through, the player is stuck to have no place to play unless he reports.
The only reason why I bring that up is because I remember a circumstance a couple years back with the Centennials when they traded Curtis Gettig to Cowichan Valley. Scott Jacklin and Jimmy Gearian came back the other way. Jacklin didn't end up reporting, and the Centennials subsequently traded him prior to the deadline. Jimmy Gearian went through the deadline, but then the Centennials wound up releasing him, and he showed up as an affiliate player with the Penticton Vs. That would have been a situation where, because the Vs had that card available, they were able to do that because the Centennials outright released them. Have I got that right?
Sign a Junior B card.
Okay.
Sign a Junior B card. And I think it's important that your listeners understand that players that are traded that are American, those Americans, it's conditional on the American signing a form that says he'll agree to go from one team to another.
Really?
Oh, yeah, because it's a U.S.-Canada agreement. He's an American player. and they're not subject to Canadian rules, Canadian Hockey Canada rules. So there's a U.S.-Canada agreement in place that all players at any time when they're traded from one team to another, Americans, they must sign to say they agree to go. So if a player goes from Cowichan, American is traded from Cowichan to Merritt, Luke Pierce knows that before that player steps on the ice in Merritt, he must sign, and that form must be registered with BC Hockey, a consent form that says he agrees to go. It's his right. It only happens with American, and it happens with Canadians down in the U.S. It's an agreement works both ways.
And it has nothing to do with where the player may have played last year or whatever. It has everything to do with where they're actually from.
Exactly. It's his rights as an American choosing to play in Canada. The thought process is that he is recruited to come to Cowichan. He wants to go to Cowichan. He agrees to go there. He may not necessarily agree to go as an American to Merritt. Right?
Okay.
So they have, Hockey Canada, USA Hockey put a form in there. The player must agree to go. That's different than a Canadian in a private league. If he wants to play junior A hockey, it's supported through the regulations, then he must go.
Now, how about a situation with imports? If there's a team that has too many import players and they want to try to add one, say a player that's from the Alberta Junior League or Saskatchewan or anywhere else really in Canada, I know that they count as an import under BC Hockey League rules. That means that team has to somehow release an import or trade one, whatever the word you want to use, right?
BC Hockey League rules on all of that they don't apply. It's Hockey Canada regulations. Hockey Canada regulations say a team can have no more than 8 imports on the roster at any time. And an import would be in a first-year transfer, Alberta player coming to, say, play in Merritt. He would be an import in his first year, but a non-import in his second year.
Right.
But a team can sign and release any number of imports, but they cannot have any more than 8 on the roster at any current time. So if a team wanted to sign, they had 8, and they wanted to sign another import,